Welcome back to another Boxscore Geek show. It has been a while, Brian, but that's in large part because, well, the NBA has been off. There's been news. There've been no sports, and coronavirus is still rampant in the United States, despite our ability to pretend it is not. Let's date ourselves, Brian. It is. Let's see. My watch says it is June 23rd of 2020. For any future listeners, so for those that have forgotten, Trump came out and did one of his first rallies in a long time in the midst of a pandemic that has claimed the lives of over 100,000 United States citizens. And everything just looks bizarre and weird. And in the midst of all that, because we are an NBA show, we are going to be talking some NBA like gossip rag rumors about Paul George. We're going to be talking about Donovan Mitchell and Rudy Gobert, a topic that is near and dear to our hearts, but we're going to put it in the perspective of, protests and NBA players using their clout for good. And then, of course, as we mentioned, we're in the middle of the coronavirus, and we're going to be talking about the impact of the NBA trying to reopen in the midst of that. It took a long time to get to the introductions, Brian, but people have been waiting, so they can wait a little longer. I'm Dre Alvarez, known most places as Nerd Numbers, and with me, as always, is my producer, voice of God, man of many hats, found on Twitter as Boxscore. Brian gave away the name in that teaser, Brian Foster. Say hey, Brian.
Great to hear from you, Dre. Great to be back on the show. It's been around a month, I think, since we've done a show, so it's good to do another one. Yeah, it's hard to stay interested in the NBA for me right now because of the reasons you said. It's not going on, and there's so much else going on outside of the NBA. And I agree with what you said. I think the last show, I said something like, "I have a feeling of dread. We're just reopening, even though." We being the United States, right? We're just reopening everything, even though nothing's been solved. We haven't actually done the due diligence to do the reopening, and yet here we are, still moving forward with it, and the results are disastrous. So, yeah, I mean, I expect July to be awful, and it just sucks to be sitting here with that feeling of dread, knowing. It's like we're steering the Titanic, right? The ship is on its way towards the iceberg. It's going to take a long time to change that course, and it looks like we're just running into it.
So I actually have a metaphor I've been throwing about for our first topic. Was the first topic we're going to talk is a little bit about the state of the NBA's current plan about reopening. And in large part, actually, that's been a big reason we haven't been podcasting is news moves so fast that usually we try and record these on Tuesdays, and we are recording on a Tuesday, go us. And the day will be so much in flux with news and everything going on that it'd get close to showtime and you and I would be texting each other and I first off it'd be like, well, I feel terrible, so I don't know if you feel like talking about hoops first off. And then sometimes you'd be like, well, we don't know what's going on because there'd be like three wash bombs about the NBA's attempt to reopen, et cetera, and we didn't know what was happening. Just as an example of one, I don't know if it happened on a Tuesday, but it did happen during the middle of a week, is there was a day where Disney basically said, hey, by the way, Disney is not going to enforce the bubble for its employees. For those that
Yeah.
don't know, hopefully, if you're listening to this show, all this is just repeat, and hopefully, it's also out of date. Like that's one of the problems I've been mentioning is that so much has been happening so quickly that we've been having trouble keeping up with the plan. But the supposed plan essentially is the NBA wants to finish off the regular season about 8 games a team for 22 teams. So the top 22 teams in the NBA are all going to go out to Orlando, finish up the regular season. Obviously, the real regular season is 82 games. This season, that's going to factor out to about 68 because I think most teams had completed about 60. Finish up the regular season, and then have a playoff structure. And I don't remember how the playoff structure is going to be set up in terms of seating, et cetera. It's probably out there somewhere, but I haven't looked too much in depth. Honestly, Brian, because in the back of my head, I kept thinking, there is no way this happens. And so when I'd see news about the proposed bubble plan, et cetera, I'd kind of go, well, I'll look at that later, maybe, but surely they're not going to keep going, right? And as an example, you kind of said, the feeling of dread. Several states, one of them being Florida, another being Wisconsin, go Wisconsin, my home state, kind of opened preemptively before everything was fine. And Florida has just been spiking. in the midst of coronavirus, as well as people I respect that look at the numbers have been saying Florida's numbers are fishy, even taking into account that they're spiking. As an example, like pneumonia deaths are off the chart for the year.
And I'll briefly
Uh,
add, Florida's just kind of stopped reporting a lot of coronavirus stuff, so they're just trying to cover it up.
yeah, and I think their governor has said stuff about that. Not Houston, because Houston's a city, not a state. Texas's governor has started
Hey,
saying
don't
stuff
say that to the
too.
people of Houston. They probably consider themselves to be a state.
Oh yeah, well, I mean it is a fascinating part about the United States, and we've talked this on the show before about things like elections, et cetera. Is I looked this up. Texas in 2016, and this was based on something you told me on the show, Brian. So you actually gave me the idea to look this up the other day, in looking up, was almost 4 million people in Texas voted for Hillary. The
Yep.
way our system is set up, Texas has 36 votes because we have an electoral college. Texas has 36 votes, which is like 10%, not 10%, 5%, about 5% of all the possible votes,
Yeah, they're
right?
the
The
third
electoral
most
college.
populous state, right? So
Is
they're
what it's
they're big.
538 total votes, right? That's how 538 got its name. 538 electoral college votes. Texas has 36 of them. So 4 million people in Texas voted for Hillary, which is a huge, huge number. I believe it's the second most behind California.
No, California and New York both had way more
Oh, New
people that
York.
voted for Hillary.
Oh,
And so
so
what
so
I
basically,
was talking to you about before was the opposite, right? Which states voted for Trump even though he didn't win, like including California. But yeah, Texas and Hillary is the same thing but opposite.
yeah. So I mean, 4 million people in Texas voted for Hillary, but in spite of that, all of the votes went to Trump because 4.6 million. It was 4.6 million for Trump in Texas, 3.9 million for Hillary. You know, if we didn't have an electoral college, you basically you'd split the difference, and basically it would be something like 1917, something like that. But that's not what we have in the United States because we are weird. Um, but that being said, Texas is just gigantic as a state, and that's part of the problem, right? Is you have one governor in charge of Texas, and that governor is saying places that mandate face masks might not be eligible for federal aid. And I do want to stress one of the things we've been scared about on this show, talking coronavirus, isn't that we're scared to talk about it because clearly we are. It's more two parts. One, you've noted there are a lot of makeshift experts on the internet now. A lot of people that are like, "Well, I'm clearly a medical doctor because I read one NPR piece or
Are
whatever."
we gonna subtweet or are we gonna put on blast an NBA guy about this?
Oh, dear God, it's been a month, so there's so many stories I've forgotten. Okay, so that I mean, that was going to be one of our topics on a previous show. And it's something what I'm really proud of us about this, and this is what I was saying, Brian, is we're not going to pretend to be medical doctors. And this is something you, as the producer of the show, producer, co-host of the show, have been very adamant about is when we talk about subjects to kind of know our role, know where our strengths lie, know how to say it. So we're trying to obviously do coronavirus as reporting what is established fact, and our opinion is about things like the business side of the NBA, the analytics side of the NBA. There was a famous blogger podcaster, Nate Duncan, and I've kind of mentioned this is weird, like he's involved in my origin story, so to speak, as an NBA blogger, and that I met him at Sloan, and we were both roughly the same size on Twitter. We were both, I think, about 3 to 4 thousand followers at that time. And I met him at a Sloan, and I think he was called like the Team Rebound was his blog name or whatever. And we kind of went in two different directions where he went very mainstream, picked up the Golden State, became kind of established as an analytics blogger, which, amuses me to no end because, he's another one of these, which is really bizarre in the NBA analytics movement, a lawyer that's really interested in NBA analytics. And I would argue doesn't necessarily have the strongest strength in analytics. But I've still kind of said, Nate Duncan is what I would like kind of ESPN to be at, right? I would like ESPN's level to be at Nate Duncan's, and then the Nate Duncans of the world to be at a higher level math and statistics wise than they are, and they are not. We might get into that in a little bit. But somebody responded to him. He had an opinion about the bubble in Orlando, and I don't think we ever quite flushed this out. The NBA is
I
trying
don't
to
have the
finish
link right now, so we won't
yeah,
show it.
but yeah, the NBA is trying to finish the regular season in Florida. The key, which I didn't discuss with the bubble, is this idea that they're going to essentially be an isolated community doing this because if coronavirus is is rampant, you want to reduce the risk of infection, which is reduce interacting with people that may have it. And so their plan is, oh, if we go into a place that's kind of quarantined and isolated, all of our players are safe and can play. Sounds good on paper. And some of the players, of course, have been complaining, not even about the health aspect, but I mean, just as an example, being being constrained in one area for several months for basketball might not be what people are interested in. Lo and behold, the United States as a whole went stir crazy after like 3 weeks of quarantine. And then, of course, a bunch of legislatures caved and reopened things preemptively, kind of for no reason. And Nate Duncan responded, he's like, well, I've got no problem as, like a reporter with the idea of a bubble. And there was a, I think an EMT, if I recall. I'm not getting this 100% right. So go look it up. Go look up Nate Duncan. And he basically said, a medical professional responded to him and said, here's why you're wrong about something. And Nate Duncan responded, well, I've been podcasting about this. So I think I know what I'm talking about, which just, like I said, kudos to you ahead of time, Brian, in that you have kept our head on straight for this podcast about like where you don't want us to go. And you don't want us to fall into that folly and go, well, we've been podcasting about this for 5 years. So clearly we're medical professionals. That is not the case. And Nate Duncan, rightfully so, got flamed pretty heavily for that. And I don't know if it'll stick around, but at least for a couple of days, it was a meme to say, I may not know this, but I podcasted about it a few times, so I'm pretty
Oh,
much
I
an
didn't
expert.
see that
That was
aftermath.
that was like, I don't think it's necessarily stuck in the zeitgeist, but at least for a couple of days surrounding that kerfuffle, I was seeing that everywhere on NBA analytics Twitter, and I was like, oh geez. So yeah, that kind of stuff has happened. So again, when we're
I
talking
wish I had
Corona,
his level of confidence, I guess is all I have to say. Or maybe I
I
don't. Maybe I don't
I don't
want.
I it's weird. But so we're trying to report, but then of course so much stuff moves in terms of coronavirus, and just like I said, so many stories have happened even since we podcast last. Many might happen before this show, gets officially put out there, etc. So who even knows? But the kind of overarching theme we've had on this show and still have, and again, stressing, this is based on things we're seeing top medical professionals report, based on reporting numbers about coronavirus spikes, etc., and based on the idea of the bubble, about basically this not being a good idea to try and reopen the NBA. And like I said, I kept going, I'm not even going to read the details of this idea because there's no way it happens, right? And what's really bizarre is that the news keeps getting worse, if that makes any sense. Florida's coronavirus numbers are spiking, even though, as you are noting, there is a lot of, to put it mildly, controversy about how the numbers are being reported in Florida. And in spite of that, they're still spiking. Um, Across the United States, there are a lot of numbers spiking. A lot of players are exhibiting reservations about things. A story that maybe we should talk a little bit about, I don't know how much this crossed your radar, Brian, is Kyrie Irving started coming
Yes.
up against the bubble,
It was him and
and
one other player, right, were
Lou
speaking out.
Williams also
Okay.
so what's interesting is there are many angles you can approach the why the bubble in Florida to play the NBA season is a bad idea. Um, the first off just being a sheer question of logistically, will this work? That I think is the key one, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. So that's, I would say, just the most baseline, the one we've had on the show going, with the virus still running rampant, with there not being a vaccine, with us not knowing the long term impacts of it, with us not being able to necessarily guarantee that the bubble's going to stay intact. Is this a good idea? That's one level. Another is players just maybe don't want to be isolated, maybe don't want to be involved in this kind of bizarre, almost reality TV experiment. I mean, there are legitimate reality TV shows that are like, we isolate people for months and see how they react, and they go nuts, and you get lots of good camera footage. Then there have been people like Kyrie Irving and Lou Williams that have also been coming out and saying, in the midst of the George Floyd protests, and so for those that don't know, it should be kind kind of shocking at this point. There was a man killed by the Minneapolis Police Department named George Floyd. Is it 8:26 or 8:32? Dave Chappelle did a comedy special named that because that's how long
8:46, I want to say.
something like it was over 8 minutes. So a
Yeah.
police officer held their knee on George Floyd's neck for over 8 minutes,
And
and
two
he died.
others also need one to his body, one to his lower body. So there's
Jeez, all
three
right,
police kneeling on him at once.
ridiculous. So that happened. He died, and there have been a lot of Black Lives Matter protests in response to that. A lot of people arguing about defunding the police, etc. Topic for a huge topic that could fill many podcasts. Brian, we'll see if we get to it tangentially. But the point being, all of these protests are going on, and it's been a huge number of protests with kind of a sustained momentum that we haven't really seen in the United States. And what is more bizarre about it is how much the mainstream is coming behind it, including a lot of NBA players. As I mentioned, Giannis Antetokounmpo in Milwaukee has gone to protests. I feel really bad that I'm forgetting his name, but there's a really cool player. Is it Malcolm Brogdon? I think drove to a rally in
That wouldn't
Indiana.
surprise me. All the Warriors players, Steph Curry, Clay, everyone walked in Oakland at the protest as well.
So it has been getting a huge amount of public support. And so Kyrie Irving and Lou Williams have been saying, we're kind of distracting from that if we try and come back. Um, Kyrie Irving said some other stuff as well, things like, hey, we could start our own league. That's a topic for an entire other day.
See, I was
And
agitating for that during the last lockout that the players should start their own league, but yeah, it's funny.
yeah, that's a big subject that we should hit at some point on like a down week, which we may never see again, Brian, with how the world is right now. Um, but one of the more interesting parts about Kyrie, and I don't feel bad making this comparison. I feel sometimes when you wade into this territory, you have to be really careful when you make comparisons like these for obvious reasons. And what I'll say is, for those that don't know the civil rights movement, Rosa Parks was a huge figure in civil rights movement. But what was also key is the civil rights movement heavily vetted her before, if this makes any sense, backing her as the face of the movement. Because Rosa Parks was a woman who, notoriously, as everybody knows, back when they had segregated buses, refused to stand up on a segregated bus and was arrested. And, that led to a lot of things like the bus boycotts that, in theory, helped the civil rights movement along. And dear God, it would have been nice if the United States had decided to keep going after the 1960s instead of going the opposite direction, which is why we're back where we're at. But she was heavily vetted. They basically said, if we're going to have someone that is the face of our campaign arguing for these things, it has to be someone without problems. And there was like another woman that had a similar court case. I forget her name, but she's shown up in various podcasts and news stories about the subject. Who essentially was like an unwed mother, and the world's changed a lot, but in the 1960s, that was a huge blemish. They went, her character will be assaulted mercilessly if we back her. We have to back someone that the mainstream media cannot tear apart the character of. And what was very telling is when Kyrie Irving came out with these concerns and said, I don't know if we should do this. Of course, his flat earth stuff came up. Of course, his fights with LeBron James came up. And what was very, very telling, and I noticed some NBA bloggers I respect, NBA analytics community going, is like, it's very telling where you stand if basically you're just going to tear down Kyrie Irving based on, his supposed character flaws and not, his actual argument. So again, him and Lou Williams have come out and said stuff like that as well. There's just not wanting to do it. There are lots of reasons for NBA players not to want to be in the bubble. And in spite of all of this, the NBA is plowing full steam ahead.
Yeah, that's right. Well said. And we we mentioned Adrian Wojnarowski earlier, and he has dropped two of those Woj bombs today, or sorry, Woj bombs, that led us to start talking about this on one hand. So let's bring them up. This one really struck me. He says, as coronavirus testing for players heading to Orlando starts today, teams are bracing for significant numbers of positive tests. One Western Conference playoff team had 4 positive tests in the past few weeks per sources. Full training camp start on July 11th at Disney, and that's about almost 2.5, 3 weeks from when we're broadcasting here. And then we also briefly talked about this, the other one from today. Uh, Wojnarowski tweets, reporting with Windhorst ESPN, Brian Windhorst, of course. Side note on Brian Windhorst, his role in the Game of Zones last few episodes was amazing. I really enjoyed the Game of Zones finale. But back to the Wojnarowski tweet. Reporting with Windhorst, Nuggets star Nikola Jokic tested positive for coronavirus in Serbia. His return to the U.S. is temporarily delayed. He's been asymptomatic since testing positive last week. Jokic is expected to be cleared to travel to Denver within a week. So, when I see all this, I just can't believe that. Well, I can believe it. I understand, what the stakes are. Both the league and the players need to keep this cash cow rolling, right? They don't want to leave all that money on the table. So they're trying to decide how much risk can we take on by reopening the league. And it just, I know we're going to get into what Ari Caroline said, but who is a legitimate expert on this. But I just, when I listen to people like that, I just can't see how the league's going to move forward with this. And, someone like Wojnarowski has his finger on the zeitgeist of, NBA elite owners and agents and whatnot, top players. He seems concerned too. Like, what's going to happen? What if a team has half their players test positive in the middle of the playoffs? Are they just going to, concede that playoff round? There's some other league going on in Florida. Florida seems like that's where all the sports happens now. That's where pro wrestling seems to happen as well, because they're just letting everyone reopen. But so I think it was a soccer team in some North American league said, yeah, we're just going to withdraw from the league. We have too many players testing positive to keep playing. So I just don't see how that's not going to happen in the NBA, especially when, again, the next month or so when they're going to try to reopen is when the positive cases are going to start ramping up in Florida. And as you said, they're not doing the full lockdown. So again, I hate to talk about this kind of stuff, but as a non-expert, I just cannot understand what the NBA is trying to do right now.
Can I ask a question that you probably know the answer to better than me? Is ESPN and Disney, are they still affiliated?
Yeah, Disney owns ESPN. So that's a very important point that we should not overlook.
So this is something you always kind of do, I think, because of your political science background, is you kind of will go look for the motivation. When we blast bloggers or players or coaches, you kind of go, well, why are they doing this, right? Why, this blogger that is clearly putting out clickbait, what is their motivation? I gave it away with the tag, right?
They're
doing clickbait. Their job is to get clicks, right? So they have a very clear motivation. My foot has fallen asleep, so hopefully
I just adjusted my position
my
too.
desk
We're
as I
getting
move around.
fatigued at the same time, Dre.
All right. So anyway, a very key point about this kind of machine that is pushing everything. So let's see if I can tie all this together. Disney wants to host the remainder of the NBA season, which makes sense. Disney owns ESPN, as we note. ESPN has a big contract deal with the NBA. There is this weird circle. I'm not going to use any crude terms, Brian, but there is this big circle connection of people. Let's call it a rat's nest, right? You've got a rat's nest of people connected together that have a very big incentive monetarily for the NBA to keep going. And it's troubling on multiple fronts, right? Because ESPN reports things. And so a lot of the news, right? The way people were noting correctly that the way ESPN sites were reporting on Kyrie Irving seemed to have a very clear bias. Now, we've noted before, ESPN is not news, but similar to like Fox News, there's no rule that tells people not to treat them as such, and they do act as a news organization. So ESPN, Disney, the NBA are all basically tied to each other with huge monetary stakes to give a huge incentive to the NBA to come back. And that, we kind of have the tail wagging the dog, right? In terms of this big juggernaut that keeps saying why the NBA needs to come back and all this stuff happening at the same time. I think that is a key point. in terms of what's going forward. I think I had one other point, but I've already forgotten it. So, but all of that going on for the NBA coming back, and then you asking about, what's going to happen. An interesting metaphor I have related to Orlando, by the way, is Grant Hill. Because for those that don't recall, Grant Hill was this really great player that played for the Detroit Pistons and signed a long-term deal with Orlando and got injured playing for Detroit. He was injured and he kept playing on a hurt foot and sustained long-term injuries. And as we've noted many, many times on the show, Grant Hill was the heir apparent to Michael Jordan in so much as he attained more All-Star votes in a game that Michael Jordan was in the league. As a like a funny sidebar, after the Last Dance, various other players such as Kareem Abdul-Jabbar were coming up as like who belongs in the GOAT discussion. And I noted, I was like, for what it's worth, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar isn't some super ancient player. He played in the NBA the same time as Michael Jordan, that guy in the
Yes.
Last Dance that everybody's talking about. They played in the league the same time. He won a Finals MVP when Michael Jordan was in the league. Let's not act like he played forever ago. And then I, of course, had to take a dig, and I felt a point we're going to talk at the end of the show, Brian. I felt bad afterwards. I took a big and I said the overrated big that gets by because of their era you're thinking of is Bill Russell. And then of course Bill Russell has been coming out and saying lots of good stuff about civil rights and pro protest, and I'm like, damn it, this virus has put a lot of things in perspective as to we argue over who does better on the court with a round ball. And when you look at stuff that really matters, a lot of times you're like, yeah, the people I like doesn't relate to how good they are at putting an orange ball through a hoop.
Yeah, that's fair, and you're right. If you again, we're going back to Oakland here, my neighborhood. Bill Russell is one of the most legendary figures to come out of Oakland. Period. So everyone respects him, and I think it is of course because of his play, but I would say what he's done since his career in some ways is even more amazing. Just the man and the leadership he's had. So yeah, we can disparage Bill Russell's play, but Bill Russell, the man, is a legend on the West Coast, and I think
I
in all the
actually
United
want
States.
to clarify where I stand there and also note a bias I have, which also comes into effect with Donovan Mitchell, which is I get rankled by the amount of praise heaped on Bill Russell because I know it's bullshit, if that makes sense. In that, I've said Bill Russell, the comparison people have made to me, and I agree, is like Bill Russell would be Ben Wallace or Bill Russell would be Dennis Rodman. And I firmly agree with that kind of point, meaning Bill Russell, right, played his entire career with the Celtics, won 11 rings in 12 seasons, I think.
Something like that,
And
yeah.
I think five, I think he got five, I think he racked up five MVPs, something like that, four or five. And certainly would have won multiple finals MVPs. They named the award after him because the award didn't exist while he was playing. And I'm going, no way in hell you convince me for a second that he wins one MVP ever in the modern NBA. And no way you convince me that he's a franchise player with the team. He gets bounced around like Ben Wallace or Dennis Rodman. So I feel sometimes my animosity, again, because it's towards the box score, it's towards Bill Russell's box score, not Bill Russell, the person, is going, everybody putting Bill Russell in your top five, top 10 all time. I'm like, I know it's not true because modern players that are great at the things Bill Russell was great at, you would laugh at putting them as a top five active NBA player, let alone top five all time.
Well, I'll just pile on, Dre, and say that one of the stories about Bill Russell when he was growing up in Oakland, he went to McClymonds High School, the legendary basketball school in Oakland, was not good enough to make the varsity team, similar to that Michael Jordan story, but he fought through it and later made the varsity team. So Oakland
In
didn't think he was good either, apparently, when he was in high school.
that's a freaking high. I mean, I hate the high school like, oh, they were snub, but anyway, that's a story for another day. Let's talk one. Let's give a huge shout out to former Wages of Wins box score geeks contributor Ari Caroline, who was on the True Hoop podcast with Henry Abbott to discuss a litany of things. But I think the key part that he talked about was this exact point, the bubble. And
Yeah.
what's key to note is Ari Caroline was the former director of analytics at Sloan Memorial Kettering, the premier cancer research facility in the United States. And I apologize, Ari, I've forgotten the current company he's with, but he actually does work with a medical company currently that is actually, and he did the wise thing. Unlike ESPN reporters, he said, full disclosure, I work for a
Tempest
company that
Labs, Dre. Tempest Labs.
he works for Tempest Labs, and they are a company that is working on coronavirus testing. So, he's very he pointed that out. He said, I'm going to give my opinion on coronavirus, the bubble, etc. But I'm going to disclose first off that I do work for a lab that provides testing, which is what anybody that works on anything that could potentially make money should do. This is a very academic thing. Admittedly, it's amusing. It's an academic thing to do, and people don't pay attention to it as much as they should, which is when you write like an academic publication, you'll say, full disclosure, the authors of this paper were offered a grant by Big Tobacco to write this paper on why tobacco is healthy. And admittedly, yeah, they're admitting a conflict of interest, but you can still notice, you're like, oh, well, they still released the paper. I'm still going to question this. And just because they put it on doesn't mean that when, say, a mainstream media site that just reads the headline of an academic paper and reports on it as fact doesn't mean they're going to read that part. So, but he did do that, and he talked a lot about it. And maybe you're in the same boat. And it's been a couple of weeks since I listened to the interview, so it's not
Yeah.
super fresh in my mind. But I just recall when he was saying, "Here's all what needs to happen for this to work." Going, that sounds really difficult. Is this really going to happen? Because he did go over how frequently you would need to test, how quarantined you would need to keep it, what kind of the logistics. And as I mentioned, go listen to the True Hoop podcast for him to recap that, because it's very good. And I think Henry Abbott also wrote a piece about it as well that included some of what he said. And I just remember hearing it going, I don't know if that seems doable. And a shout out to Travis Heath, former hoop type blogger, and he's a PhD, doctor of psychology at Metro Denver, I believe, and has worked with multiple NBA teams, including the Denver Nuggets and Minnesota Timberwolves. And he was just like, "Hey, I worked with NBA teams, and getting these players to listen to curfew was really rough. So are we really going to believe that a super lockdown quarantine in Florida is going to be listened to by everybody?"
Yeah, well said. And the thing that struck me about that Ari Caroline interview with Henry Abbott was the numbers that he was mentioning. And by that I mean the kind of numbers that are being reported by the NBA for what they're trying to do. We're going to put this number of people inside the bubble. We're going to try to do this many tests. It seemed like it was kind of off by an order of magnitude of what Ari Caroline was talking about. He was saying that they were going to test, a few hundred people, I guess, or a few thousand, every week or every day. Like, sorry for forgetting the details, but then Ari was saying, well, I thought they would be testing people in the magnitude of tens of thousands because, again, like you said, the employees are there as well. You said that earlier in the show. So just listening to that show reinforced my bias. What the hell is the NBA trying to do?
Oh, and by the way, thank you. You just reconnected the thread when I was talking Disney way back on the show that I forgot, which is one of the days a story that came out is Disney said, "Hey, we're not going to require our employees to listen to the bubble procedures." And multiple NBA players, JJ, I love JJ Redick, man. He's gotten his own podcast and great Twitter follower, and just funny person to listen to. Really good NBA role player. I want to make sure I put him in the right
Hey, he's
strata.
still like a rotation player going into his mid 30s. Like, that's very impressive.
That's
That
super
very
impressive.
impressive.
Oh yeah, but he responded that like, "Wait, what?" And this was kind of the story I'm mentioning there happened kind of right before Kyrie came out and was like, "Hey, I don't necessarily know if we should do this." And that's just another issue, right, about this entire thing is the NBA is looking to fly players into one of the biggest spiking states in coronavirus right now, um, into a bubble that is already compromised. And another aspect of this that I can't really argue against that is really starting to just I think I think optically it's already looking bad, Brian. I don't know if this has quite hit mainstream perception. I think there is a fine balancing act between the austerity looking bad and people just really wanting sports back, but many people noting, hey, I can't get a coronavirus test. Jenny Nicholson, one of my favorite YouTube vloggers out there, does fantastic stuff. If you're a Star Wars fan, if you're a Land Before Time fan, she just did a video on that. You should check it out. But she's also tweeted about how she's had some fears about having coronavirus and says locally she can get a coronavirus test for $130 and it's not covered by insurance. And so the NBA is saying, hey, we're going to be spending thousands of tests. R.A. Caroline saying it should be tens of thousands. They're saying thousands of tests a day so that these multimillionaires, and by the way, a slight tangent on that, Brian. Years and years ago, one of the best writers at The Wages of Wins and former editor, Devin Dignam and I wrote a piece about the NBA lottery fallacy. And what we meant by that is a lot of people would use the average. They would say the average NBA player makes $5 million a year. Can we really feel bad for them, right? And we kind of pointed out the flaw in the math because you had players like LeBron James making upwards of $20 million a year at the time, Kobe Bryant making $25 million a year at the time, and going, you're talking average, and it's like intro to stats
Yeah,
101.
where's the median, right?
You should be using median, not mean there. The NBA salary cap explosion has turned it into the fact that we have some ridiculously wealthy people at the top of the NBA. And even it was funny because Kyrie Irving was saying the NBA is tiered to fight us against each other, right? Only like 20 people making money.
Yep.
What is amusing about that statement is he's half right in that the NBA is a very tiered structure and the supermax contract players get a percentage right and everybody else doesn't. So there is a disparity in how much the best players in the NBA or top players, for instance, Paul Millsap was one of these, get paid versus the rest of the league. But we're hitting the point where the 20th, the 100th, right? That was a big deal in the Last Dance documentary is how poorly paid Scottie Pippen was. Like
Yes.
Scottie Pippen in the modern NBA, with as bad as he was paid in the Last Dance, would still be making, I think, like $10 to $15 million a year if we're doing proportionately. So we're hitting the point where the amount of money in the NBA, we've agreed forever that it is an unequal split between the owners and the players. That being said, the pie has gotten so giant that the players get a ridiculously large amount of money. And from an optics perspective, with a pandemic running rampant in the United States, saying we are going to spend, if we're talking thousands of tests a day, and this goes for a couple months, right? 2 to 3 months, we're talking, tens to hundreds of thousands of tests just to play basketball when, hospitals, et cetera, are reporting shortages on tests and, protective equipment. Is that really the best look for the NBA? The cynic in me says that just having sports back because the United States loves sports so much, they'll overlook that as there. At the same time, I'm wondering how that'll look for the NBA.
It's a big risk for them. Another side of it that I think I've seen some players and writers talk about is, we mentioned a little bit on this show, but not as much. We're on the third week now of Black Lives Matter protests, and of course the NBA is a mostly black league. So black players have said, is this something we should be doing? Coming back and opening up the NBA when there's this struggle going on and COVID, right? So people are concerned about that as well.
Oh, 100%. I mean, the last point, and this came up in the True Hoop podcast. I got a feel for the dude. I got a feel for Greg Popovich, because an example Ari Caroline gave was he said, hey, what if when we're talking at the age of these that the at risk age, you've got a lot of NBA coaches. D'Antoni
Yes.
and Greg Popovich, two of the most prolific NBA coaches, are in that risk range. And for what it's worth, if you look at the data, it is true that coronavirus is proportionately less dangerous for younger people, kind of. Obviously, a risk is immune compromise, right? So, the pre-existing condition kind of issue. That being said, people have basically called it kind of willfully, ignorantly an old person's disease. And I'll kind of get into why that's willfully ignorant. One is you can look at the numbers, and a decent chunk of people are at risk in that, I would say, 40 to 60-year-old range. And the United States retirement age is 65, right? So when people are trying to use the argument, well, coronavirus just kills people that were going to die anyway, one, that is a morally abhorrent thing to say. And if you see people on Twitter and Facebook saying stuff like that, please just block them and mute them and don't invite them to Thanksgiving when things reopen. But regardless, the numbers do back that a lot of people that are still in what I would call working age, and you and I are bumping up against that, Brian, right? We're both near 40.
Near 40.
Yeah, okay. Yeah.
I'm
Well,
well into my 40s already.
I was going to say you're near 40, right? I'm technically correct.
Oh, I see. Okay, I'm
There you
near
go.
40 if it's not Price is Right rules.
Exactly. Okay, so there is that dangerous age, and a lot of NBA coaches, not just the old ones, not just the D'Antonis and Popoviches, are in that range. So we run into this, and like I said, the reason I felt for Greg Popovich is I keep seeing his name going around as what happens if Greg Popovich dies? What happens if Greg Popovich dies? I'm like,
what
I
if
feel
LeBron James dies? Like that could happen as well.
I agree. Well, I'm saying if you're talking about playing the risk the NBA is really playing is more with a coach than with a player. But what I'm also saying is the NBA might say, okay, people over this age aren't allowed to come, right? Which might exclude Greg Popovich. Now you get into funny territory there then as you go, well, does that hurt the team, right? If they don't have their amazing head coach come along with them, I think it might actually help the Spurs. But
hey, what about Becky Hammon on a video call with Pop during the game? They're talking it out.
There you go. That would be ideal.
Or Tim Duncan, right? He's the other assistant head coach.
Or just let Becky Hammon coach straight. But that being said, the key I want to make there is people are going, oh, these older coaches, maybe we should exclude them. And I'm going, the numbers say you should probably exclude many people in many age ranges that aren't, because we're talking the coaching staff, the training staffs, et cetera, that really shouldn't be there. And then you noted there is a non-trivial chance. I mean, a player that we both love is JaVale McGee. And JaVale McGee is a player with asthma. There are players, there are top flight NBA athletes that have had other health risks. Don't forget, Chris Bosh was forced to retire when they found blood clots in his lungs, but he would have been playing with them. So there is a very real possibility that some NBA player has some pre-existing condition that they've been playing through that they might not even have diagnosed, and they might die from this. And is that really a risk worth taking right now?
Yeah, and that's what they're trying to figure out. And yeah, I mean, players have autoimmune disorders and whatnot, and that is a risk as well. No, that's why I still think this is not going to happen. Like, we're going to go, forward with the next month. Cases are going to spike in Florida, and the league's going to, maybe pump the brakes a little bit. But let's just think about the wide range of scenarios for the league reopening. What's the best scenario? Well, some players test positive. They have to sit out, but the league goes through the playoffs, crowns the champion. Great. We made some money, right? That's the goal here, really. Don't leave that cash on the table. I think both the players and the owners have said that's the goal. But then the bad scenarios are just awful, right? Again, teams withdrawing from the playoffs in the middle of the playoffs because they have too many sick players. Players or coaches dying of the disease. That if that happens, that's just a stain on the league for decades. And
the Grant Hill scenario I brought up, which is we may very well not suffer a casualty in terms of death. Many people I respect have noted that death is such a ridiculous statistic to try and use for coronavirus because first off, we've had a ridiculous number of deaths, an unacceptable number of deaths.
Over 120,000 at this point, and it's going to go
being
up.
the number one cause of death in the United States over the last month is not acceptable. Again, same Facebook, Twitter, social media thing. You see someone that's like, oh, what's the big deal? Just get them out of their life. And if they ever bring up that they're pro-life, just block them extra hard. That being said, that's a bad metric because other metrics to use are people that get this. We're seeing lots of stories, and I want to float the bigger picture. We don't know. That's the key phrase I want to come away with is we don't know. Because there are stories of people showing possible lung scarring after, and we don't know the long-term effects. And that's the bigger issue, and that's why I brought up.
Dre, you talked about Chris Bosh and blood clots. There's evidence that people that have recovered from COVID have blood clots.
Which, yeah, and so that's the point. The Grant Hill point is this playoff might happen. We might not get a casualty. And then one of the issues I've said about the NBA is, when people are talking about like declining ratings, I was like, well, the simple fact of the matter is the Cleveland Cavaliers and Golden State Warriors, have been fighting each other for the last 4 years. And suddenly, because of injuries to Golden State, they're not a playoff team anymore. And because LeBron James left Cleveland, Cleveland's not a team anymore. And, that removes stars from the league. And that's bad because the NBA is a star driven league. If we have long-term health implications, like we're already crowning Luka Doncic as like the next big thing, right? Rightfully so, I would argue. As a sophomore and his age, he looks ridiculous. Like I
Yes, I
said,
agree.
I think Mark Cuban, I don't know, found a haunted mansion or something that had a cursed key, and he asked to like always have the greatest European player on his basketball team, and it came true. That's my only explanation for a team that had Steve Nash, Dirk Nowitzki, and now Luka Doncic.
Oh, is Steve Nash European?
Yeah, or Canadian. He's Canadian. I guess you're right. Yeah. So international. How's that? International.
That's fair.
Okay. That being said, let's say his lungs get damaged and he's never the same after the season.
Yes.
Was that worth it? Like, one of Patrick's first pieces at the Boxscore Geeks was on the sunk cost fallacy. Why we see a lot of teams wind up in Andrew Wiggins scenario. Namely, they spent a big draft pick on a player, a number 1 draft pick. They've given this player any top draft pick that stayed healthy gets like over 10,000 minutes in their rookie contract. So you've given him over 10,000 minutes, a first pick, a massive contract. Can you really afford not to play him? Can you really afford to trade them? And that's classic economics 101, sunk cost fallacy, right? The value of a good has nothing to do with how much you paid for it. It's what its current value is at. And we're seeing a sunk cost fallacy here where the long-term potential risk to the NBA is pretty vast. And they're basically at this point betting on nothing going wrong. And the metaphor I wanted to give to you that just is so weird to me is, do you remember this, Brian? Earlier this year, it was the biggest thing. There were multiple documentaries about this. This was everywhere on social media. Do you remember Fire Festival?
Absolutely.
So for those that don't know, this social media influencing firm tried to come up with a big festival that was supposed to have a bunch of influencers there, and they charged a ridiculously high amount per ticket to get a bunch of essentially rich, naive people to fly out to this island to hang out with social media influencers. And it turned out they had no idea what they were doing. There was not enough booking on the island to handle everybody. They didn't have water. There's all sorts of funny stuff if you want to look it up there. And it was, it went down as just like, oh my God, what the heck happened? This was a horribly run thing. And if you look over the actual story, there are a few documentaries, similar
Really?
problems to The Last Dance, in that people directly involved had like editorial approval on them. So, you can question how biased or not these documentaries are. It was a weird fight between Hulu and Netflix where they released their documentaries at the same time, kind of a Pixar DreamWorks kind of feud going on there. But essentially it was this festival that from very early on was very obvious it was not logistically planned out well, and it wound up in disaster with a bunch of kind of like entitled white kids that paid too much for a ticket to an event trapped on an island without like amenities or water, which was fascinating. And it's kind of weird because we heard about that after the fact, like, oh my goodness. And as I mentioned, it was everywhere on social media. It was a huge thing. And we're watching the NBA kind of in real time do it. And honestly, I'm hoping it goes off without a hitch and no long-term things. But I just keep going like, really? And we'll have to see where we're at in about a month.
Yeah, and that's right. I guess since personally I have no idea what, the type of money you make in the NBA means, that I can't sympathize with the positive view. But the negative, outcomes are just so negative that it could damage the league for years. And, here's the thing though. I'll give the opposite view some credit, which is Adam Silver has been really saying that we're just going to take this a day at a time. and we're going to make a plan, and it's probably going to change, and we're just going to keep going forward and try to do it. So I think that Adam Silver will cancel the league if things get bad. It seems like he's willing to do that to me. But maybe that's not true. Maybe there's too, like you said, maybe things are already in motion and there's nothing he can do to stop
But
it.
I guess that's what I'm saying is like, to many of us, we're like, isn't it already bad enough? Like, what do you need? And the kind of capper I'll put on this before I get us on to our more trivial topic, and we've talked about this already on the podcast, is there is something absurdly poignant about the fact that the start of this, the very, very start of this entire, whatever you want to call it with the NBA, I want to call it a debacle, but like I said, the optimist in me is saying, let's see what happens. Maybe
That's
it's
one
not
of
a
my
debacle.
favorite words. You just used debacle.
Debacle, love it. How many is that worth in Scrabble, I wonder? Anyway, not a lot actually. I didn't have
A lot of
rare
vowels
words.
in debacle.
Yeah, yeah, nothing good. Anyway, that being said, the very start of this happened with an NBA owner that had a master's degree in epidemiology arguing about a Forbes piece saying Forbes undervalued his $1 billion team. His team was worth more money. And then that team leaving the doors open, and then that team debating if they had the money to pay their staff. There
And
is,
then
and I'm
playing
talking about,
extra games when they should not have played extra games.
exactly, and I'm talking about the Golden State
Yep.
Warriors and Joe
Joe
Lacob there.
Lacob, the epidemiologist, the owner.
There is something fascinating about that. And as we're mentioning, the NBA still seeming to go forward. And if it all goes forward, we'll be able to say the same thing. Go, one of your most influential and lucrative owners is in theory an expert on this subject, and you still went barreling straight ahead into a potential catastrophe. And like I said, the frustrating part and what this owner has already shown us is if everything turns out okay, then the ego on them is just going to be sky high. We've kind of argued that the Warriors were more lucky than good in terms of their 3 titles and 5 attempts, right? So I think they made the
Yep.
NBA Finals 5 times, came in with 3,
That's right.
which is remarkable. That is a ridiculous accomplishment for what it's worth. And of course, at the end of it, Joe Lacob in the midst of it, Joe Lacob notoriously said his team was light years ahead of the NBA, which was beautiful because it happened right before he lost a 3-1 lead in the NBA Finals. But the arrogance, if everything turns out okay, is going to be ridiculous. And I guess the one thing I want to make sure to give this the Brian Foster perspective is there's a lot of money on the line for the players. There's a lot of money on the line for the owners. There's a lot of money on the line for ESPN and Disney in terms of this, as well as implications to the NBA CBA, which is the agreement they all have about how much they get paid and how things go in the future. So it's very much a lot of sunk costs on this. And honestly, this is the more uncomfortable reality. There may very well be a cost benefit analysis that says this is worth it. That smart people might be looking at. Who knows? But from the outside perspective, it is baffling that it is still going on, and we'll see where it's at in a month.
Yeah, I agree 100%. That's what's going on right now. The NBA is doing a math problem, right? They're just looking at all these scenarios, they're crunching the numbers, and they're going to see if they can go forward or not. And I'm in this time, I hate to get political again, but in this time of pandemic, just the actions of all these oligarchs is laid bare, right? We have Trump, who's just a propagandist. We have Facebook, Mark Zuckerberg, another propagandist, just putting all this bullshit out there. And I think the NBA is the same way, right? Like you said, they're oligarchs. They're making calculus, and maybe some people will die. Maybe we'll make some money. I don't know. Let's put it into a math problem. The whole thing is very distasteful to me. That's all.
I'd agree with that. And then, of course, let's get chapter 1 of Wages of Wins, which is sports fans love sports.
Yes.
And so you give them sports, and they will. We've seen that in the midst of many things. I mean, Kobe Bryant's the poster child of this podcast, and he alone shows much of the cognitive dissonance that goes along with being a sports fan. So it's gonna get pushed to the brink, right? That's where we're at, right? If coronavirus keeps getting worse, and the problem in the United States is We are not actively doing anything as a nation right now to improve things. There's one software development issue, again, to date ourselves. So who knows where things will be in a week or a month or the next time we podcast. Um, but Dr. Fauci, I hope I'm getting a pronunciation
Yep,
right,
that's right.
came out and said today he thinks that a vaccine is around the corner, could be before the end of 2020, could be the start of 2021. We both work in tech, which means if ever anybody gives you an estimate on a difficult project and they give you a bound and say as early as this and as late as this, you take the late date and you add a month.
Yes,
Now
that's
I'm
right.
not a now again, let's be clear because we don't know. I'm not a medical professional and I do not know the state of the vaccine and I also don't know the logistics, right? Let's say we get a vaccine tomorrow and it turns out that it's really really expensive to produce it or really really difficult to produce it. A lot of people are comparing this to the 1918 um, flu, which it's amazing how history repeats itself because it was called the Spanish flu, but it didn't originate in Spain. That was a
Yep.
propagandist term, and so we're
Apparently, Spain like treated it the best, and their doctors figured it out. So that's why it was called the Spanish flu. Like that's not very fair, is it?
and recently we had Donald Trump. I'm not even going to repeat it, Brian. I'm not going to give him that platform, but he said a racist term to refer to it
Yep.
very similar. So there you go. Um, a lot of people and someone I like brought up a story that said when the flu in 1918 when they got a vaccine they hadn't ramped up production for it so it actually took them longer to get it administered because it took a while. Good news is we're in the future, maybe things can happen more quickly, but again, I don't know the logistics, I don't know how quickly that could come about, so we might luck into a vaccine and everything being all right, but with where things stand as of the recording of this podcast, I agree, it leaves a sour taste in my mouth.
Yeah, and I hate to get into this, but again, my understanding is we may not just need one vaccine, we may need more than one. And the manufacturing time is very significant. So, yeah, just finding one vaccine is not the end of it. That's just like the beginning of the recovery.
And then we run into similar issues that we already have with vaccines, which is people say, I mean, wearing, I understand the pushback in this country about quarantine. And a large part of that has to do with social nets in the United States. Compared to other developed nations, the United States social nets are the worst. And I'm talking things like unemployment benefits,
Yep.
medical benefits, public transportation, things like that. The United States just fails. So there are other, I mean, even in Europe, what's funny, right, is you look at Boris Johnson versus Donald Trump, this, the supposed right wing takeover of government, which did happen in both the United States and Britain. It's like, that's real bummer. Boris Johnson is like, Boris Johnson would be like a hardcore Democrat in the United States versus being conservative in Britain, which is that's where we're at as the United States. We don't have the same social nets as other countries. So when you tell everybody just stay home and don't do everything, it's like, well, we're not making money, we can't afford medical bills, et cetera. I understand that. But we're at a point now where the advice to everybody is if you're going to go out, social distance and wear masks. And the numbers, I've seen different numbers on polls, and I've got my own anecdotal evidence driving around town here, but it's just like it is pulling teeth to get people in the United States to just wear masks. And so even if we get a vaccine, who knows how easy that will be to administer. So many logistic problems we haven't cleared, Brian. But that is where we're at. All right. Let's talk Paul George very, very briefly and then get out of here. And
Yeah.
kind of two things. So, the fascinating part about Paul George is Paul George opened up about why he left Indiana because you're not super topical because that's like, what, 20 teams ago at this point. Um, but Paul George basically insinuated, and people didn't quite, this is very much like that song, you're so vain, you don't even know that the song's about you. Nobody knows who that song's about.
Maybe Warren Beatty, supposedly.
Interesting. I love it. She actually auctioned off the someone knows she auctioned it off, but they're not allowed to say. So
Oh, that's funny.
anyway, but he came out and said the reason he left Indiana is he had insight. You could basically call it inside information with how it has to work in the NBA. That the best power forward in the league wanted to come to the team in 2017, and the owners or management basically balked and said, we're a small market team. This would be Kevin Pritchard too, by the way, which is fascinating. Said, we're a small market team, we're not going to be able to keep them. No. And so Paul George is like, well, I'm not going to stick with a team that doesn't want to get the best power forward in the league. Let's give a few caveats to this first. We've said this before. Anytime you hear a historical trade rumor, we almost had, Patrick Ewing, Michael Jordan, and Magic Johnson on a team together, but then at the last moment, Michael Jordan said he wanted more money or something, right? Take them with a grain of salt always. And they might not have been as close as you think. Another metaphor I brought up is there's a fantastic story of Billy Beane wheeling and dealing in the book and movie Moneyball. And the post-credit scene to that wheeling and dealing that isn't in the movie, that is in the book, is that all of the deals he got handshake deals with over the phone fell apart because after the other teams examined them, they basically said, and they were not interested. It's very much the Jerry Maguire, until it's in writing, until it's signed, it's not real.
Yep.
So always take these kind of things with a grain of salt. Just because Paul George said the best power forward in the league wanted to come over doesn't mean that that's necessarily true. It does seem likely we've seen this kind of thing before where small market teams are wary about trading for big name players that aren't on guaranteed contracts because they might leave. I do agree with that. Early on in the story, people were saying he might be talking about Blake Griffin or LaMarcus Aldridge, and if so, they made the right call. Which is just another funny kind of high level concept we come up with all the time. But the one takeaway I wanted to have, Brian, then I'll let you get your words in on this, is that what I find more amusing is the small market team issue is a self-inflicted wound by the NBA on itself, and it is a ridiculous argument for the NBA to have, not for Paul George to have. But as an example, the last major move in the NBA was the Oklahoma City Thunder moving from Seattle. The NBA having teams in bad markets is just a bad business maneuver. And it's funny. It's very much like this coronavirus thing we're talking about, which is very much, short term oriented, not thinking long term, which is the NBA could have multiple teams. Interestingly enough, if they were in healthier situations, Florida would be one of these markets. In big markets, right? You would want to have lots of teams in New York and Los Angeles and Chicago and Florida, and you would want to have zero teams in markets like Milwaukee, Indiana, Denver for other reasons. They have too many teams there. And so what's funny is I agree that the Pacers might think Anthony Davis isn't going to want to stick around here, right? Because, he did go to LA. And it's funny where I think that they can be wrong in saying if you had a chance at Anthony Davis and Paul George on a team together, for the love of God, take that. And if all you come away with is one title, you've made your money. That was what Toronto did with Kawhi.
Yes.
At the same point, though, if the NBA wants to say, "Oh man, oh woe was me, these small market teams can't compete," it's like, well, they don't belong there. There is no reason for a team to be in Indiana. And the metaphor, the comparable I give to people who think about this, if you're politically minded, is small market teams are the electoral college of the NBA. If you think the electoral college is a stupid way to select a president, which it is, then you should have no problem seeing the issue of saying Indiana should get as much sway as an NBA team as the Los Angeles Lakers.
Yeah, I mean, and this is what we always say about the NBA, right? What is the NBA really? It's just a club of 30 billionaires. I think the way you put it is playing with a set of toy trains. You've said before, right? That's a good way to put it. And it's clear that while the league talks a lot about, well, we have to set all these rules for competitive reasons and everyone needs to compete and all that. We talk ad nauseum about the draft lottery and how we should do that, or even the draft itself for that matter. And stories like this just make it clear that not all these teams are really trying to compete. They're just trying to make money or be part of a club.
Yeah, and I mean, I I think I've made this metaphor on this. I've said metaphor a million times on this show, Brian. I'm recognize that when I re-listen. I hate myself. I've made this comparison before, which is the NBA. I've compared it to Quidditch, and I think you said, "Oh God," and I feel bad because J.K. Rowling is just keeps digging that ditch for herself. But it's a made up game in the world of Harry Potter that has like essentially it's a game with multiple games going on at the same time. There's like a game of tag happening while there's a game of like rugby happening while there's a game of like two versions of tag happening at the same time with different rule sets. And the incentives in the NBA between teams, between players, between coaches, between front offices are not all aligned. And that's why we get these, right? Paul George wants to make max money while playing for a contender. Well, if the Pacers don't want to be a contender,
Yes.
Paul George wants to go elsewhere. Well, you say, well, why on earth is LeBron James going to Los Angeles? If he wanted to play for a contender, he'd go to Philadelphia. And you go, well, his incentives might not be to play for a contender. His incentives might be to make a lot of money and, play on a big market team. I know Carmelo Anthony left the Denver Nuggets to go play for the Knicks, and the Denver Nuggets were a better team. It's an interesting one where I noted this about like the Last Dance when Michael Jordan retired the first time, with people going, "Oh, the Bulls were just fine without him." The real answer is, if you think Michael Jordan was a productive player and he left a good team, they could have been better together. Carmelo
Yep.
Anthony played very well for the Knicks. I mean, overpaid, but still played very well. So if
Well,
he'd
he
stuck
had
around with
one
the
good
Nuggets,
year.
yeah,
I'll say one
I'm
good
I'm
year
gonna
in the Knicks.
I'm gonna give him his due, Brian. I'm gonna give
Okay.
him his due. And just say, like, if he was an above average player that stuck around with the Nuggets, they could have done better. So it's like, but his incentives were different. He wanted to get a max contract in a big team, in a big media market team. So everybody's incentives are not aligned. So that's what we're seeing. And that's a problem, is a lot of the rules, things like the draft lottery, they all treat it as if everybody's incentives are the same, and they are not. And this story just brings it up, and it was definitely amusing. I'm a little sad that it wasn't like Blake Griffin, because then we get into territory like actually Michael Jordan territory, or like GM LeBron, where sometimes an issue you have with a star is your star is amazing and productive and helps you win, but the players they want you to bring in may not be great. I'm actually talking more about Michael Jordan than LeBron James there. Michael Jordan, some of his takes for players he wanted on the Bulls were bad. And I mean, another funny example is the Lakers, for example. um I don't know if this is right or wrong. They refused to trade Andrew Bynum for Jason Kidd, which at the Andrew
Really?
Bynum was incredibly productive for what it's worth.
Yeah, before
So
he got hurt, he was good.
before he got hurt, he was good. And then, of course, basically they ignored a trade demand from Kobe Bryant. They ignored his demands that they needed to get Jason Kidd, and of course, righted the ship. So it's one of these where sometimes your star players make trade demands and don't know what they're talking about. This being the case, Paul George plus Anthony Davis, there was nobody else on the team at the time that I would have minded losing for Anthony Davis. I mean, we love Lonzo Ball and Josh Hart, and the Lakers gave them up for Anthony Davis, and we still think that was the right maneuver.
Oh
So
yeah.
it's one of those where Paul George is right, but then we just get to say, yeah, the small market narrative we just absolutely hate. All right, very very last subject, Brian. Then we can get out of here.
Oh
I'll
yeah.
try. I'll let you decide how long your response to it is, to decide how long the show is. But funny thing happening in the midst of all of this is Donovan Mitchell versus Rudy Gobert. Obviously,
Mm.
Rudy Gobert turned into a villain very quickly because he's a person that did not take coronavirus seriously, contracted coronavirus, and is why the NBA shut down as early as it did. Now I'm conflicted on that because he was clearly wrong and irresponsible to do what he did. But I also have to question if the NBA shutting down when it did, and even though we ignored it after a couple of months, the fact that the nation kind of shut down, I do wonder how many lives that saved, given that this is an exponential virus. So, I refuse to say his actions were intentionally good. It's kind of one of those, like, you start a fire, but it turns out that fire puts out something that's worse. But obviously he was a villain after this, and people were already saying him and Donovan Mitchell had a rift that couldn't be mended, and he might be demanding a trade. Of course, that's before we knew the NBA was coming back this season. Maybe we'll see where we're at in a month. Donovan Mitchell has come out, like many other players that I respect, like Giannis Antetokounmpo, in favor of the Black Lives Matter protests, and very much love that. I don't know if you're aware of this about Salt Lake City, Utah, but it is a very white state with some race issues, Brian, in terms of attitudes. So Rudy Gobert retweeted a Serena Williams, but the Serena Williams is not the Serena Williams, and the retweet was about essentially an all lives matter post. And so what I've said about the COVID quarantine and sports being suspended is it brings into stark contrast an issue we've had on the show many, many times, which is on this show, we're called the box score geeks, we end up arguing about on court production a lot. And we have argued for years at this point that Donovan Mitchell is an average NBA player that shoots too much, whereas Rudy Gobert is a star. Again, my entire argument about Bill Russell is Rudy Gobert is an example. He has one all-star game at this point, despite the fact that he's a multiple defensive player of the year winner and an amazingly efficient, he can score better than Bill Russell ever could. Rebounds, blocks, is an amazingly good defensive player. Everybody agrees on this, but does not get the all NBA, all-star accolades we believe he deserves. But you take away how good they are at putting the ball through a hoop, and I like Donovan Mitchell a lot more than Rudy Gobert, despite the fact that with all the stuff I've written about Donovan Mitchell probably never wants to talk to me, and I have multiple Utah Jazz bloggers that have either muted or blocked me, or I've muted or blocked them, arguing over Donovan Mitchell being overrated at putting a ball through a hoop. So with no sports occurring and very important off the court issues happening where we see players taking a stand, it does kind of get into an existential crisis as a sports fan about being like, oh yeah, the players that I lionize aren't necessarily the players that I respect. So is what it is.
No, it's well said. It's important to keep that separate. And I've been thinking about Rudy Gobert a lot. Of course, the famous, COVID moment where he's touching the microphones, the recent story you just talked about, and I've seen some other things as well. I'm ready to say that at this point in his career, Rudy Gobert is basically Dwight Howard when he was that age. Hall of Fame level player on the court, but just kind of someone who's immature and seems that people don't like him off the court for whatever reason. And, from my perspective, it looks, Mitchell will probably win the Battle of Wills in Utah, and Gobert will have to be traded. Teams should be looking to trade for Gobert, get him at a cheap price. Even if he is that immature guy, work him into your system, get that Hall of Fame level play, and make it happen. Go for the cheap value. I don't blame Donovan Mitchell for not wanting to play with Gobert anymore. I don't know if that's true, but last I heard that was true. I would bet they'll gut through the playoffs together, and that'll decide things. But that's kind of how I see the state of Rudy Gobert.
It's interesting though from an optics perspective, right? If the Utah Jazz make the finals or win the finals, like if the Utah Jazz knock out the Lakers, in part, let's say hypothetically, right? Let's say LeBron James withdraws with COVID symptoms and the NBA keeps going, and the Utah Jazz with Rudy Gobert knock out the Lakers. Is that the look you want? I'm seeing a lot of people say no asterisk for this season. And here's what's funny. When I saw that, I came back and noted the same thing about historical NBA. I noted that in the ABA NBA history, there was always, and I believe this is true. If someone can contradict me, or I might do research on my own, but it would be very hard for this statement I make to not be true. There was always a hyper competitive series between multiple top, I would say 5 teams in the NBA in every playoff, such that I do not mind a champion being crowned with no asterisk every single playoffs that occurred. So, like as an example, even if you said, right, the Warriors against the Cavaliers a few years back had an easy finals, I think they beat them 4-0 after that overtime loss, right? They beat the Houston Rockets in 7 the series before.
Yes.
The 2 best teams in the NBA played, right? So, and every playoffs is like that, right? Where, the best team in the league had to play a really tough series against another top seed, such that I'm like, yeah, playoffs inherently are not about deciding the best team. So the real question just becomes, did the team that ended up winning it all have to face another really good team at some point in a best of 7 series? And I believe every playoffs, since the advent of like the 7 game, I know like some of the 60s series are really weird. The answer to all of that is yes. So I've got no complaints. This playoffs is different, where exactly what you're saying, right? If a team wins a hard-fought battle against a really good team in round 1, and then that team loses 2 of their stars to COVID in round 2 and loses to a weak team, what do we say about that? We've never seen a playoffs like this before, ever in NBA history. And so, again, the ending optics of it could, like I said, if Rudy Gobert does really well, and costs an established star that is more
Interesting.
well liked than Rudy Gobert, what is that going to look like? Like if Donovan Mitchell, let's say Donovan Mitchell gets long term health from this, right? Let's say he gets a problem. I'm putting up the absolute worst case scenario with no medical knowledge. So again, I want this clear. This is like a hypothetical that I don't even know the odds for and would probably place the odds for this low. But let's say Donovan Mitchell gets long term lung damage from this. Rudy Gobert wins a title and ends up costing LeBron James, who has to sit out due to COVID. Like, is that the image the NBA wants to come away with at the end of the season?
No, of course it isn't, and that's what they're weighing, right? Do we want to? How much do those sweet dollars weigh against the risk of something like that happening? I do have to go back to the Dave Barry point though from Wages and Wins, which I think you're very right to bring up, which is they're probably calculating, maybe 5 years down the road, even if this is a debacle, we'll get through it and people will just still love the NBA. So it's this wartime mentality, right? And I think I've spoken out against this on the show before, but when you try to say, look, this is a war against the disease, this is a war against COVID, what you're doing is framing it such that casualties, losses are acceptable, right? So that's the cynical view. If people get sick, if people die, well, they're heroes and they helped us win the war and we're going to keep moving forward.
I'm very sad that you might be right, and we'll just have to watch as this develops. I think siding with cynicism is unfortunately the right
Sorry
choice.
to go farther on this, but just think about it. What if a star player does die of COVID? Just think about what would happen on social media. I'm sorry for laughing, but there's going to be, it's going to be just like Kobe. It's going to be, we're going to go through all this mourning and, lionizing. And yeah, it's just going to be, I can't even think about this. It's so bad.
Man, you've depressed me because you're right. I mean, it's one of those where, yeah, you want to think, oh, this bad thing happening will snap people out of it. Some of the psychology research on that shows, right, that like when you talk things like cult mentality, etc., getting proven wrong sometimes causes people to rally even more firmly than they were before, which is like the 7 Day Adventists, right? That was a doomsday cult that said the world was going to end and it didn't. And notice they're still around. So is what it is. I'll let you get your shout outs in, Brian. We'll see how long it is before the next time we podcast. And yeah, we got a nice long show like old times.
Yeah, I do have some shout outs. We mostly talk shit about, the media and what people are writing, but we we both love Todd Whitehead at Nylon Calculus. He has two great articles from the past month that I loved. One is about, it's titled Regression to the Mean Can Even Fool NBA Coaches. And he brings up some stuff from Thinking Fast and Slow Right, Daniel Kahneman, very famous psychology book from the past 10 years that we talk about all the time on this show. And let me just read this quote real fast. I won't read the whole thing, but basically what this Kahneman quote that he brings up is something effective. He was talking to somebody who trained fighter pilots in the Air Force.
Oh, yeah, I know this.
Yeah, you remember. And what Kahneman says is, to paraphrase that this instructor said is, well, whenever the pilots do bad, I criticize them and they do better. But whenever they do well, if I compliment them, they do worse afterwards. So that's why I think criticizing these pilots is the best way to do it. And of course, Kahneman's points is, no, it's just regression to the mean. When you do poorly, you're going to do average or well next time. And when you do well, you're probably going to do poorly or average next time. And that's just the way it goes. And Todd Whitehead goes on to say that his high school basketball coach was like this as well. And he thinks NBA coaches are too. So I love that, very pertinent take. And then this is a massive, massive article that I think only he and a few other people do. Like, you have to scroll a long way to get through this. It has lots of data, lots of text. But the title of this is To Crash the Glass or Get Back on Defense in the NBA. And this is a big pet peeve of mine, Dre. You know that. People have said that, nowadays in the NBA, the strategy is never crash the glass. Everyone gets back. So therefore, offensive rebounding isn't good anymore. My point is, if if it's harder to get offensive rebounding, then it should be at a premium because it's still valuable, even though it's rare to get. Todd Whitehead dove deep into this. He took a look at two teams. It was the Lakers and I want to say Oklahoma City. Yes, the best and worst transition defense teams. And he looked at every possession and what they do and why they were better or worse at transition and how often they crash the glass. It's really interesting. I'll try to paraphrase his conclusion. Basically, you can crash one or two guys. It's the three guys that are always running back that matter for transition defense. That was basically his conclusion, and he did a great job with it. Really great graphics as usual. So, yes, Todd Whitehead's keeping me alive for basketball reading during the pandemic.
Now, there's a funny two-parter, which is I would say in the NBA, there is a benefit about teams being slower to adapt than you would want, but there is a problem in professional sports about any strategy, which is basically as you adopt a strategy, other people adapt to it. And so things like how many people need to crash the glass, what makes that fascinating, right? You just said might be at a
Yes.
premium if people can't do it. It's well, how how many people is defense leaving on to do it, right? So as strategies adapt, I mean, like Maury Ball is an example of something where taking more threes isn't intrinsically a better strategy unless other teams do or don't. So
Yes.
in sports, I will say the following, despite us being these very nerdy people that are like, basketball is a simple game. You just want to look for productive players. Sometimes you have to be careful when you start adapting strategies because the strategy is based on how your opponent is going to behave. And if they change, what you do might have to change. And, the funniest example I give is the Warriors small ball is I argue a reason the Warriors small ball was so successful for so long, in part because they did have a productive five players doing it, is that they would bait the opponent into playing small as well. And if you do a silly strategy, but your opponent does a sillier strategy in response, that can work out very, very well for you. And it's, when teams, unfortunately, the not the Knicks, the Thunder did not keep it up, but the Thunder almost knocked you out of the playoffs a few years ago on the 73 win team that did eventually get upset by doing exactly that, saying we're just going to ignore small ball and play big.
Steven
So
Adams,
I'd be,
baby.
but yeah. Anyway, sorry, that was a long detraction there. That is good show, Brian. Hopefully, we'll be talking more. Hopefully, the world's in a nicer place. Although I'm done with optimism for a while, Brian. I think I'm going to stay cynical until proven wrong. Anyway, that's been the Boxscore Geek Show. If you find us not through the website, you can find us at boxscoregeeks.com. I've been your host, Ray Alvarez, found most places as Nerd Numbers. Co host Brian Foster, found most places as Boxscore Brian, or just Twitter. I don't think your other places are Boxscore Brian. I don't know, Brian. We go live some Tuesdays, depending on how we're feeling, usually around 9:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on twitch.tv/nerd numbers. And of course, we have an iTunes and Stitcher show that you can find the Box Score Geeks show. Thanks so much. Have a week, and we'll see if there's NBA.